Bé, bon dia a tothom i moltes gràcies. Gràcies també a l'Institut d'Estudis Nord-Americans per comptar amb mi, particularment amb tots nosaltres, i sobretot per fer aquest debat que ni el propi Institut d'Estudis Nord-Americans s'imaginava quan el va plantejar, que avui l'estaríem fent en aquests termes, uns termes que segur que han canviat fins i tot les intervencions dels nostres ponents avui, dels nostres panelistes. I will switch into English and then it will be easier for everyone. So we will have two tables to debate today. The first, it will be NATO-oriented, and the second, EU-oriented. They know already, they have maximum 10 minutes each to make first an introduction to the topic, and then I would like for them to have a discussion also among our experts, and then surely I will ensure that we have time enough for your questions, because I can imagine already that there will be many of them probably. So let's start already with NATO 8th strategic concept, balancing US and European priorities. We will have, first of all, our first speaker making the introduction to the issue, Dr. Jeffrey Michael. He is an IEN Senior Fellow in American Foreign Policy and International Security at IBE, the Institut Barcelona d'Estudis Internacionals, and formerly he was a Senior Lecturer in Defense Studies at the King College in London. He has also served as an official with NATO and US Defense Department, and of course as an academic he has so many publications and reviews that you already have in the CVs that you got at the program. So Michael, you have 10 minutes. They want to use the podium. I hope that they don't do that to escape my time control. I will take care of that. But, please,
certainly not. So I'm actually stepping in for Dr. Thierry Tardy, who sadly could not be here today from the NATO Defense College. I'll be speaking about the strategic concept, introducing it, and in terms of keeping to time, I can basically sum it up in terms of the content of the strategic concept in 4 words: March, April, May, June. Okay. The job of drafting the NATO strategic concept is not one that I would want right now. Such is the volatility of the times, not just including what happened in the last week with the war in Europe, but just what happened this morning. And I want you to just sort of get a sense of how important what happened this morning, how important it was, or at least it could have been, or it might still be. So when we think about physically attacking a nuclear power plant, this is being the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, just imagine what the strategic consequences of that would be for NATO, and especially a NATO strategic concept looking forward. So let's just imagine for a moment that the Russian artillery or rocket attacks had actually hit the main reactor, and we are actually suffering right now from a nuclear disaster on the size of, or probably even greater than Chernobyl, probably much greater indeed. We would not be worrying about a NATO eastern flank at the moment. We would not be worrying about Russian tanks at the moment. NATO's primary job looking forward would be decontamination. It would be preventing the refugees from overrunning Western Europe, looking for fresh air and working hospitals and all of the rest of that. That's just to give you a sense of the size and the scale, the nature of the transformation that could conceivably occur as a result of this crisis. Now, again, thankfully, it doesn't seem like, at least the news that I've seen recently, that that's actually occurred, and hopefully that will not occur. But this is a nuclear crisis, and be an absolute no doubt about that. Just yesterday, in fact, when it was just a war that I was worrying about, I compared this to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and was wondering, have we reached the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis point yet, or we have actually reached beyond that at this point? So where are we going to go from here in terms of potential nuclear use, potential chemical use, and so on and so forth? But the nuclear danger is definitely there, and especially given what we've seen with Putin and his comments, questions about his rationality, we are literally back in the early 1990s when our big fear was of a rogue nuclear Russia. So if you can recall back to the early 1990s when we were worried about people like Zhirinovsky taking power and what would happen with Russia if it descended into chaos. So that's the bad news. I just want to sort of go back and provide a bit of context to sort of where we are now, how we got here. And I think the good starting point is if you go back to 2010 to the last strategic concept. When it was drafted, this was at a time, if you recall, when NATO was very much involved in Afghanistan. That was the key priority. Geopolitical conflicts and geopolitics as a whole, excuse me, was not really very much of an issue. This was very, very far down on the agenda. So then fast forward 4 years to 2014. So here you have the Russian annexation of Crimea, its various other activities in the east of Ukraine. And even at that time, there were questions that were being raised of, do we need a new strategic concept? Because clearly the old one seems to be out of date already. Now the decision was taken more or less not to produce a strategic concept at that time, and every year thereafter there were calls for, can we finally have a new strategic concept to reflect this changed environment? And the view was that no, that would be inappropriate. Let's just stick with whatever summit communiques and declarations and whatever commitments we make with regards to those. Now, in terms of NATO's response to the actions in Crimea in 2014, essentially for the first 2.5 years, NATO did very little. It wasn't until the Warsaw Summit of 2016 that you begin to see a shift in behavior with the dispatch of 4 battle groups to Eastern Europe, so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland. Very small tripwire forces, but not very much more beyond that. It was a fairly limited gesture, if I could put it like that. And that certainly from the perspective of the Baltic states, I think, which Lucas will be touching on in a few minutes, that was probably the understanding. Now, a couple of years beyond that, you have some more efforts to beef up NATO's forces in the east, or at least the follow-on forces, should aggression actually occur. Then Trump increasingly focuses very much on China and gets the alliance talking a lot about China. So around 2019, 2020, you have a shift in the discourse within the alliance. So it's not just about Russia as the big threat and perhaps terrorism in the southern periphery as the second major challenge. Now suddenly you have this rising China, which is talked about increasingly. Now, let's fast forward to December of last year. Starting with the Russian military buildup, you have a new shift in thinking. And it wasn't even a matter of they're going to invade Ukraine. It was the very fact that they could build up such a large military force opposite Ukraine and threaten Ukraine, something on the size we had never even contemplated really before. Seriously, we've not seen before in a serious way. This became the new threat, in a sense, that they could actually mobilize those levels of forces. And then, of course, for NATO defense planners and so forth, this became the new baseline. Last week, we have the Russian invasion. So now we actually have a militarily aggressive Russia that we need to contend with. And so this changes the thinking even more. So you have NATO deployments, more NATO deployments to Eastern Europe. NATO, in my mind, was quite slow in invoking Article 4 to actually even hold consultations about the crisis, but eventually they did after the fact, and they're slowly taking actions at the moment, perhaps the most important being the supply of arms to the Ukrainians. However, since the war started, we've now had a new development. I'm not talking about what happened this morning. The new development is everybody who's watching the Russian military operation being very much unimpressed, that it's not going to plan, that the Russians look militarily incompetent. So despite this enormous force that they built up, they do not seem to be handling it very well. This Russian bear, this Russian military bear that we thought was 10 feet tall beforehand, doesn't seem so powerful at the moment. And looking ahead in terms of what would actually mean for the Russians to occupy Ukraine and have to deal with that situation, given all the losses they've suffered already, that what sort of Russian threat are we going to be seeing in the future? I mean, is it even worth building up large defenses in the East if this is the adversary that you're facing? Now, I think the two big challenges at the moment, and then I'll stop, that we need to be thinking about. The first one is Finland. If Finland should join NATO, and they're having a debate about that at the moment, you will add 1,300 kilometers of border between a NATO state and Russia. That changes defense planning, defense assumptions considerably, to say the least. I think we also need to be thinking about what happens if Russia does eventually succeed, if they escalate the violence, if they do succeed, perhaps even taking over all of Ukraine. And again, there the borders are shifting as well. Now you have Russian forces not only in Belarus, which is a recent development in sort of a significant way, but also in Ukraine, bordering Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Poland from that direction. In my mind, all the other issues are now so far down the priority list. We have one major issue that we need to be focusing our attention on now. Everything else is a lesser priority. I don't think that it will be taken out of the strategic concept. The strategic concept is a very large document, as you see with any NATO strategic communique or declaration. But in terms of our focus, what we should really be concentrating on is the Russia issue. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I have already some questions that I will make them afterwards. We will go now to Brussels, because joining us from the European Parliament, we have with us Mr. Tom van den Kendelare. He's chair of the delegation for relations with NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He's a member of the European Parliament since 2014, and in the European People's Party group. He's also a full member of the Security and Defense Subcommittee, and he holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Kent. So thank you very much for joining us from Brussels. The floor is yours. I think we have some sound issues. I guess you can hear us, right? Do you? Yeah, okay. But we don't hear you yet. So just, we need a couple of minutes. We try again? No? I think they say that probably we have a problem with your microphone. Could it be that it's not working? Let's try. 2 years of pandemic online meetings and we are still learning.
Is better?
Yeah, great now.
Perfect.
All right.
The floor is yours then.
Thank you so much. And in fact, I might be speaking a bit more than I'm given, but since I'm away, I cannot feel your evil looks at me, and I'll seize that opportunity to use my time.
My microphone will be on anyway.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks to the Institute of North American Studies Foundation for inviting me to address this meeting today. Even though I am in Brussels, I'm very grateful for organizing this timely discussion on of European defense, indeed with such distinguished colleagues in the panel from both sides of the pond. And I also appreciate the opportunity to engage in the exchange on the strategic orientations, both on EU and NATO. It was already said many times, I think, today, it is quite a time to be speaking of European defense in the light of the brutal Russian aggression against Ukraine, something that has been building up, I think, for a decade, but is now unfortunately seeing its culmination. And I would really like to seize this opportunity also to condemn once again, in the strongest possible terms, the reckless act of aggression by the Russian Federation. It is a flagrant violation of international law and an attack also on our own European security and indeed on the rules-based world order. But if you now look at the topic of today's discussion, I can only think of obviously the historical words of Winston Churchill, never waste a good crisis. And they might sound a bit cynical in the light of the unfolding drama in Ukraine, indeed with the latest attacks this morning on the nuclear power plant, but Churchill in fact use them in a comparable context, and they perfectly reflect, I think, the essence of the challenge we're confronted with in terms of European security and defense. Over the last year, I have been saying time and over again that we urgently need substantial progress in upgrading our own European common security and defense policy, and that somehow, unfortunately, this progress never would come spontaneously on the basis of political conviction or historical insights, but in fact only through external pressure, which in the end leaves no choice to European leaders to decide in such a manner. And if you think about it, In the past few years, we've seen several crises on the European continent, and we have taken steps forward in terms of European integration only because of these crises forcing us to take those steps. The pressure emanating from Russia's aggression against Ukraine is exactly the kind of pressure I'm talking about. Putin is making the Union stronger, in fact, much stronger, much contrary also, I think, to his own expectations before this war started. And during the debate in the European Parliament a couple of days ago on Ukraine, you might have listened to it, my group leader, Manfred Weber, spoke in this respect of the Kiev moment. And the Kiev moment adds to the political momentum, which was already strong, mainly due to the regained willingness in Washington also when it comes to cultivating our relations and to strengthening EU-NATO cooperation, and due also to the review, obviously, of the NATO strategic concept and the creation of the EU strategic compass at the same time. In fact, those two exercises could not come at a better time. I look forward to the meeting of European leaders next week in that sense in Versailles, where I hope fundamental decisions should be made on reducing the Union's dependencies in different policy areas, including indeed foreign security and defense policy. Cynically, the timing to make those historical decisions indeed cannot have been better. Now, one thing that is already clear to me from these, well, very few first months of 2022, that is that the multiple and evolving security challenges that EU member states, NATO allies and partners are facing make EU-NATO cooperation essential and more essential than ever, including in responding to hybrid and cyber threats and by helping our common partners. Over the last almost 6 years, the two organizations have developed closer cooperation, focused on concrete results and improved security for all citizens of our transatlantic community. But really, I think also for the people in the room, it is fundamental to understand that we Europeans attach much importance to the transatlantic partnership and to the EU-NATO cooperation in particular. This might really be perceived differently in the US, but also the EU strategic compass leaves no doubt about it. From the drafts I've seen, this is crystal clear. For us, NATO is and will always remain a cornerstone of our international security and defense policy. But it is evenly fundamental, I think, to understand that a stronger European defense means much more also for a strong NATO than a weak European defense would do. Indeed, it is an essential element, I would say, in moving towards a stronger NATO. Practically speaking, I first and foremost, for instance, hope that strengthened unity between us can, for example, steer towards a similar understanding of risks and threats, as well as a similar line of action to tackle those new risks and threats. And the growing turmoil on our continent, that growing EU-NATO cooperation is indeed critical. Now, on the year of the European defense, quite visionary in a way to have chosen that title as the title for 2022. There are a number of important European initiatives coming up to strengthen our security defense. There are plans to develop own defense capabilities. Those are evolving. There is the aim to establish the European Defense Union. A few weeks ago, the Commission has presented a new substantive defense package, which, among others, a communication on European security and defense policy, also a roadmap on critical technologies, a strategy for traffic management in space, and the proposal for a secure communication system in space. The EU leaders will discuss and adopt the strategic compass on the 24th and 25th of March. And for the first time ever, as we all have seen, the EU will finance or is financing from the European Peace Facility the purchase and delivery of weapons and other equipment to a country that is under attack. And that is in itself, I think, a very historical decision. Let's be frank about this. But on top of that, in addition, what we see is that 4 years after the adoption of the last EU-NATO joint declaration, there is a new declaration underway and expected to be adopted also in spring. It was it was planned for the end of last year, but it is now expected to be adopted this spring. And the thing is, as I already said, both organizations are defining their strategic orientations and priorities for the future. That exercise is ongoing. So indeed, I would say the golden hour is there for both organizations to work more closely together as well. There was intense work going on both concepts still. And the very fact is that those two processes, on the one hand, the compass, and on the other hand, the strategic concept, should obviously be as much linked together as they could, both at the political level and at the technical level, to ensure the fullest possible coherence and indeed identify the common regional and global threats. Now, I won't elaborate on drafting the compass and reviewing the concept, but I would want, in a way, to transcend these processes and identify a list of, to me, 8 European priorities where I think the two organizations should step up their cooperation. First of all, there is obviously the hybrid and cyber attacks. I think we should strengthen our own capabilities to prevent, deter, and respond to them. But here too, the cooperation definitely is necessary. Second, we need to harness every means possible to support the strengthening of our military security cooperation, also with partners, including in the East and the South. Third priority to me is to increase the common action on the international stage to protect democracy in order to defend the rule-based multilateral order against rising authoritarian powers. And it is indeed the chairman of the Nato Parliamentary Assembly, Congressman Jerry Connolly, who is time and over again repeating the importance also of the resilience of our democracies as a crucial element in defense, let's say, against external threats. A fourth priority to me is that the 21 common EU-NATO members apply the single set of forces principle by declaring the same pool of potentially available capabilities for planning purposes within both the EU and NATO. A fifth priority for me is to increase drastically information sharing, in especially identifying hybrid attacks in order to increase responsiveness and also in the ability to attribute those attacks. Sixth priority is to support more the countries of the Western Balkans to counter foreign interference there. I think notably of Russia, China, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, as well as of radical groups and non-state actors. Two last priorities obviously are China, because we need to see a more coordinated approach there. I think between, on the one hand, what NATO is doing, and on the other hand, what the EU is doing in China, and I would say more broadly, the Indo-Pacific definitely as well. And a last one is to increase, it might seem unimportant, but I think strategically it is necessary to increase the number of joint informal meetings and joint statements and joint communications by the EU and NATO institutions' principles. We often laugh at it, but it's quite cynical in a way. Both institutions are located in Brussels. They are physically, I would say, about 1 or 2 kilometers away from each other. But the distance, especially at the political level, still is too big. Now, a last word, Madam Chair, on the review of the strategic concept. As you all know, it's a two-phase process, with on the one hand, the negotiations for the text, but there is also the public consultation. And I would like to pick up on a few of the introductory questions that had been asked for today's discussion. I wouldn't want them to leave unanswered by means of introduction here. I'd gladly like to formulate some thoughts in conclusion on those introductory questions. First of all, what could we expect in terms of substantive changes to the strategic concept? I think, as it was already said, the Russian aggression against Ukraine will indeed have its impact on the drafting. But I think the changes will, in the first place, have to take into account this changed security environment since 2010. It was well, carefully listed, I would say, by the previous speaker. Russia was then still considered as a partner. I don't think we can still talk of Russia as a credible partner in our new strategic concept. China wasn't even mentioned at that point. And think about also the impact of climate change, hybrid warfare, disinformation, emerging disruptive technologies, or AI, cyberspace, and outer space challenges. I think the world has changed quite a bit since 2010, and we need to take into account this new situation. The interesting discussion to me will be on the place of China in the text. The question is, will it be elevated to the same level? I would say I'm not convinced. China is a challenge in many ways, but it also still offers a number of opportunities, as well as in terms of, I think, very necessary cooperation, for example, when it comes to climate change. On the NATO eastern flank, it is quite clear to me as well that supplementary measures to secure the eastern flank will be necessary for a longer period of time. But NATO is following a 360 degrees approach, so it means it has to simultaneously focus on more than Russia alone, also on Africa, the Arctic, cyberspace, outer space, and so on. One question which is interesting and which actually provoked me a bit is whether NATO is set to decline in importance relative to the EU. The very fact that we're still asking that question is quite striking, because I don't think this is even a question to be considered. And I say it as a convinced European, because there is no such thing to me as a competition between EU and NATO in terms of membership or enlargement. In the past, we've seen that countries wanted to become member of both organizations, or one of them for specific reasons. I think the NATO 2030 agenda is quite clear. NATO will have to become more political and military strong with a more global range. And the tasks will be expanded, but the scope for cooperations between NATO and EU is definitely accordingly expanded. Finally, I think, yes, and I really conclude by this, I promise. The United States' commitment to European defense and how this is perceived by non-US allies. I think I'm not the only one to say that the US have shown once more in the last few days that their commitments are ironclad. And the US, as we experience ourselves, they are also in favor, I think, of a strong European defense, provided, obviously, there is an avoidance of duplication. I conclude here. I hope my reflections can be interesting food for thought.
For sure.
Thank you.
I know that you are normally obliged to speak shorter in the European Parliament, so it was an opportunity today. But we will come for sure back to Brussels. So thank you very much for sharing your point of view. We go back now to the panel. Here we have Professor Lukasz Milewski. Lukasz Milewski is assistant professor in international studies at Leiden University, where he teaches strategy. And he's also a Baltic Sea Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and has a long-standing affiliation with the Changing Character of War Center at the University of Oxford. His core research interest is strategic theory, but he also engages with strategic history as well as contemporary defense. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I was asked a few weeks ago to say something about what was at that time still the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. Of course, at the moment, it's a bit more than a crisis. And how that will affect the future direction of the alliance, particularly from the Baltic perspective. Now, as a bit of context, my background is both American and Latvian. I'm a dual citizen, very much representing the two flanks of the alliance, both of which have been skeptical about Russia, particularly Latvia, and for quite a long time. So there will be certain undertones here of, we told you so. Russians are a threat. But moving on beyond that, I was asked to present the Baltic perspective as if it is just one perspective. And that's arguable, and that very much depends on what we're talking about. So on Russia, yeah, sure, we all border Russia. We know that Russia is a threat. But on, let's say, for China, since China was mentioned in the previous talk, not quite so much. I'll say a little bit more about China later, but I'll keep that to a minimum. And directions, what do we mean by directions? So we can talk about the three main pillars of NATO: collective defense, crisis management, cooperative security, but also directions regarding what NATO's relationship with what international actors, with what international threats. So I think a good starting point here would be Lord Hastings Ismay's old adage about NATO's original goal being to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. And fundamentally, Europeans do still want to keep the Americans in. It's arguable whether or not Europe can actually defend itself from Russia without the Americans, notwithstanding Russia's apparent military incompetence in Ukraine over the past week or so. And the Balts feel very strongly about this, especially given their concerns about Western European credibility and reliability. From the Baltic perspective, the Western Europeans have not been particularly reliable over the past 1 to 2 decades. As for keeping the Germans down, well, the alliance hasn't been interested in that for decades, since the Middle Cold War probably. And at this point, well, up to, say, a week ago or just over a week ago, it hardly mattered. Up or down, the Germans seem to have difficulty acting firmly against NATO's adversaries anyway. for most of the past 2 decades. And this has really frustrated the Baltic states. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the statement by Latvian Minister of Defense Artas Pabriks from a few weeks ago, where he characterized German policy as being immoral and hypocritical. So that's sort of very much the Baltic perspective on how Western Europe in general has been relating to Russia. Of course, that seems to have changed quite drastically as recently as last weekend, with Putin's newest war revolutionizing German attitudes. And Spain, it's been noted, has committed 150 more troops to the enhanced battle group in Latvia, so thank you for that. And really, that's due not to Baltic diplomacy, as vigorous as that's been, but really to Putin and his decisions. So in a sense, thank you, Volodya. As for keeping the Russians out, well, quite clearly, as we all know, that was pretty unfashionable for a few decades. In the 1990s, it was the liberal optimism about the end of history, the end of the Cold War. Then subsequently, we needed Russian assistance and cooperation for the counterinsurgency wars. But it's back, and very clearly back in a big way. China is, of course, the new major player, and how to deal with it will be one of the bigger puzzles of the new strategic concept. And here, as opposed to Russia, the Balts have no consensus. They think differently about China. The Lithuanians, of course, as we know, have been challenging China to a certain degree, and also to a certain degree, they've been challenging China to somewhat even against the popular will of the Lithuanian public, which has been less concerned about whether or not this is really necessary. On the other hand, with Latvia, for example, at least as recently as last year, they have believed in some degree of economic cooperation still with China, sort of the sense that investment from the devil you don't know might be a bit safer than investment from the various devils you do know. And China is very far away from Latvia. So there are clear reasons to expect unified Baltic voices on the importance of transatlantic links, but there really shouldn't be any question about that in general, on energizing Europeans, and on confronting Russia, but not on China. The recent war, or the ongoing war really, demonstrates that the Balts were right about Russia, and it will really serve only to reinforce their already existing opinions. So the main question from the Baltic perspective would be, what lasting effect, if any, the war will have on Western European perspectives? I mentioned Germany has made a drastic U-turn over the past weekend in terms of its defense policy, which is great, of course. But then the question becomes, will it stick to the course? Will it really commit over the long term to this U-turn? Scholz has suggested embedding it in the Constitution, which is a good sign. But, it has to happen first, so I'll believe it when I see it. The Baltic perspective, the Baltic focus is keep the Americans in, the Americans are indispensable, keep the Russians out, they're the bad guys. Bringing and keeping the Europeans up, and particularly now in terms of maintaining the solid front against Russia, which has emerged in response to the war. Given the quite understandable Baltic focus on Russia, their main interest is likely to be on collective defense, rather than the other two pillars I mentioned earlier. Except in as much as those other two pillars might help with Russia, but the experience of the pre-war crisis in January and February really suggests that those forms of engagement, at least with Russia, don't really do any good if Russia is really committed to a certain course of action. So therefore, collective defense, from that perspective, is the only one which is really seriously meaningful. So I think it's fair to say that the Baltic interest would be to finally codify and enshrine in NATO their own less optimistic, their less magical perspective of Russia, together with then figuring out more practical measures of how to improve the defensive posture on the Eastern Front, which does, of course, include also changes well beyond the Eastern Baltic littoral itself. I'm getting to my conclusion now, so I'm taking, I think, well below time. The Balts are united in considering Russia a main threat. The US is the single most important pillar of European defense, and that Europe really does finally need to get around to fulfilling its NATO commitments, and particularly on seeing Russia through more pessimistic and more cynical eyes. On the other hand, quite undecided on China. And as for whether or not the Europeans will commit to this posture, that really depends on how amenable they are to being convinced, which it does seem that they have been, but then also to staying convinced and staying committed, which they have yet to prove. So to conclude with a sort of a final statement, to go back to Ismay's sort of witty saying about NATO, I think we can update it. Keep the Americans in, that remains the same. Keep the Russians out, maybe keep the Chinese out. And then rather than keeping the Germans down, we try to keep the Europeans up. And with that, I'll finish.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed to the three panelists. It was very interesting, and I'm sure we already have a lot of food for thought and for questions also. I imagine that you want to react to what other panelists already said, but I would like to add also my own questions, taking advantage of my position here. So the first one, it would be for Professor Michael. You were talking about all this shifting of discourse at NATO, and as my former life as a Brussels correspondent, I was witnessing some of this also with the strategic discussions in the year 2000, for instance, and the Washington summit, these new threats with terrorism then in 2001 and so on. So we've been witnessing that. So my question is, I have the feeling that with everything happening in these last weeks, months, but especially now, that this has been, I don't want to sound frivolous, but some sort of a long or all-known territory for NATO. This is some kind of finding again a purpose, because they know where they are, they know who the threat is. So do you think that this is some, well, Mr. Van den Kelare was saying that he doesn't want to sound frivolous, but in a way, this has given an existence justification for NATO again, because they are looking at NATO for security.
Yeah, so I mean, I would have to say that I'd actually go back much further. So I go back to 2014 as the more convenient point where you're starting to see Russia as a threat again. We're now in a transformational moment where our vision, our conception of that threat has, I think, fundamentally shifted compared to where it was a week or so ago. Obviously, you can certainly see this in the case of the European Union and so forth. So, I mean, what I was trying to point out before is that you did start to see a bit of a transformation around 2014. But it took a couple of years to get going. And one of the most important things that I take away, especially from comments from one of the previous speakers and others that I've talked to in the last several days, and you've also noticed this behavior in response to other crises, is that when you're in these transformational moments, the bureaucracy takes time to catch up. So do not expect this overnight. It's going to take time. It might take weeks, it might take months. I think it will actually happen, but old priorities will remain the priorities no matter how much things change. In the meantime, it's going to take a while for them to catch up. So I would have to say that for me is one of the big takeaways just from the moment, or something I would be looking very closely at the moment, is on the one hand looking at the official rhetoric, but sort of knowing sort of in the back of your minds that something is going to be changing more fundamentally. It's just going to take a bit of time. I mean, NATO does not do anything quickly. I mean, we used to refer to NATO as was it nothing after 2 o'clock or not after 2 o'clock. I mean, you can think of all the jokes about the acronym. But having said that, again, I think nowadays, due first to the buildup, but especially because of the war, I don't really think it's a matter of a lease of life. I think that, I never really saw NATO going anywhere else anyway. It might be going, staying closer to home, it might be going further away, but NATO as an organization, as an institution, was not going away. The only way I could actually see that happening is somebody like Trump basically starting the ball rolling, invoking Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty, and getting out, and then that leading to a chain reaction. That didn't happen when he was president. Maybe he'll be president again and do that in several years' time. We'll see, but otherwise, I think NATO is pretty much here to stay. They'll focus on different areas. They're focusing on an increasing number of areas. Anybody who doubts that, just look at the size, the sheer size of every summit declaration and communique over the last 10 years. They get longer and longer and longer, basically including every issue under the sun. The former speaker talked about this 360-degree conception of its security threats. That's here to stay as well. But again, I think because of the recent crisis, Russia will remain dominant. Having said that, and I think this is also one last sort of as a last point, I said earlier, March, April, May, June, I think as we saw in 2010 with the last strategic concept, it could be that come August, that concept that was approved in June is already out of date. We have to also consider this possibility as well.
So that's good for the summit in Madrid.
Yes.
Okay, so talking about these fundamental changes, I wanted to make a question to Mr. van den Kelare. You were mentioning about all this progress in the European defense policy, and you said that this would have never come spontaneously. So they are a response to the urgency. So my question is, okay, after the urgency is gone, to what extent is there a risk that these differences in consensus, existing differences in consensus, that now they were overcome because of the war in Ukraine, may arise again, and there will be some voices asking to undo what it has been done?
Yes, good question, and actually a source of concern for me in a way, because the momentum now is there. As I said in my opening remarks, long opening remarks, I admit, the golden hour is there to undertake action. And what we see is that Europeans only decide and make steps forward, difficult steps forward, whenever they are with their back against the walls. We've seen it as a response to the economic and financial crisis, that the financial supervision increased drastically. We've seen the way they have been dealing with Brexit, their sense of unity in dealing with Brexit. We've, not seen it yet enough, I would say, with the migration crisis, the aftermath there. We're working there on the compact, on the solution. So I really would expect this moment, where in fact we had prior to the Russian aggression already quite an ambitious defense agenda foreseen, I would say, that the combination, or at least the culmination of the Russian aggression is an accelerator to this. The fact, or the question you rightly ask, is how long can this accelerator effect last? And I would have been, frankly, critical about the political willingness and openness to resolutely put steps forward without the Russian aggression on this European Year of Defense and on this ambitious defense package that had been proposed. But what we now see in several member states, I was still looking at reports of Dutch parliamentary debates yesterday where they said, well, we have to go towards the 2%. Germany has indeed taken its decisions, but I think in every national parliament, there is now a very strong sense of urgency. And I would expect this, this effect, if I may put it that way, to last still for a while, and to make it a convincing effect that there would be on decision makers, because the decisions need to be made quite soon, in a way. Had we, for example, hypothetically speaking, had only the debate on the strategic compass and the defense package, say 2024, I would have been a bit afraid that it would never have led, perhaps, to the ambitious decisions that we need. Yet the decisions are expected to be taken next month, and I think this is exactly where, as I said, we should use the opportunity of this crisis in a way to make sure that the ambitious decisions that are badly needed are in fact taken.
All right. Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Milewski, taking advantage of your double nationality, as you said, US and Latvian, and because of your "we told you so." My question was, I've been thinking a lot these days also when writing about the crisis that, in fact, the US was already giving warnings, even giving dates for the invasion. And there was a certain distance on believing that, even in Europe also. Why do you think that this happened? Is this that, can we consider that the US, Washington has lost a little bit this hegemony on the narratives of what's going on? There is even a certain distance in this leadership on intel information that they were sharing?
I mean, if you look at the history of NATO throughout its entire history, throughout its entire existence, there's always been this sort of American-European divide. Presidents such as Kennedy have complained about low European spending on defense. Never mind Trump, So he just happened to be more eloquent about it, and perhaps put it in a slightly nicer way. So there's always been this sort of disparity going on here, and ultimately, no matter what, and the U.S. intel on the war has been, in retrospect, staggeringly accurate. Going back to December and even November, and they were predicting that the amount of formations which would show up, predicting that war would come and everything. And certainly that early on, no one really believed them. Even the day before the war, there were people who didn't believe them. Because ultimately, we all recognize in some implicit way that war is a hell of a thing to do, right? It's a hell of a step to take. So it's very hard to believe that someone else would be willing to take that step when you yourself wouldn't. There's sort of a difficulty in terms of crossing these sorts of cultural boundaries. And in that sense, I think because of their particular history and all the particular hopes placed on the EU and other forms of conflict resolution and peace and whatnot, the Europeans, when it comes to decisions of war, have a harder time, the Western Europeans have a harder time crossing that cultural boundary. Whereas the US, it's sort of often been said, Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus sort of thing, which is, gross exaggeration. But there is still that little bit of Americans are more active in the world, especially more active militarily. They tend to think a bit more in that way. And then with the Eastern Europeans, with the Balts and the Poles, and for example, they know the Russians. So, of course, they'd be more likely to believe the Americans here because they're more prone to believe bad things about Russians anyway, for good reason, and mostly they're true. So they have an easier time crossing a cultural boundary because that boundary is just much smaller for them than for the Western Europeans. So there's never been sort of a single hegemonic U.S. leadership of NATO. So in that sense, other countries not believing the intelligence or having a hard time believing it isn't really that surprising.
And being Venusian, it doesn't mean that it has to be wrong, in fact. So let's go for the questions, which I'm sure there will be. So I can take several if you want to. Yes, I guess we have a microphone because then you can be also heard from Brussels. I will take, yes, here. Thank you.
Well, I was not expected to be the first. But anyway, thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate the Foundation of its American Studies, North American Studies, for the initiative. This is a very good decision. And of course, Putin knew it and decided to make it even better. But now I want you, just a minute, because that is... My belief is that the 24th of February, the world changed completely. And it was Putin who did it. I just was speaking now with a good friend, Colonel, and he said, before we take many years to change the world, and thousands of that now we take less time and less debts. And I told him this sounds very cynic, but probably, I'm sorry, it's true. Now we were 4 actors in the world. That is the United States, the first, China following the road, then came Europe and Russia. That's the 4. And now we are 2. So number 1 are still North Americans, and we are the seconds with Americans. And now the other bloc should be China, and Russia has decided definitely to be at that side. And I think this changed everything. Everything. The Silk Road by Earth is going to stop because of the sanctions. They cannot pass. But they can keep the Silk Road by sea because they can pass all over by sea and the 65 ports strategic that China already controls. And many other things that we could. But I'm going to put the question. I'm very glad that Tom said that finally the Americans accept that we go for the strategic compass. Because the Americans finally has realized that they need the Europeans. The Pacific is very important, but we are here. And we also have realized that we have to invest a lot of money in defense. Luckily, finally. So that's very important. That's very important. And the last thing should be, Tom said that the Americans agree on that. Now I want to hear the OTAN about, the NATO about that. You agree that you finally got armed and joined you a second partner? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have other questions, so I will take several, and then we can get an answer from the panelists.
Hello, good morning. I'm Elisenda Calvet. I'm assistant professor of international law at the University of Barcelona. My question is to all of them. I had the opportunity to attend the meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO in November here in Barcelona, and the focus of this seminar was North Africa and Middle East, and the idea or the focus was whether NATO should had focus on this area because of insecurity. Now with the Ukrainian war, Russia, is this going to be really going down, or are we still going to have this area as an area of interest? Bearing in mind that Russia has also influence in North Africa and Middle East. We know with this resolution of General Assembly, Syria voted against. There are not many, but they've been very quiet about the situation. But there's a link with Russia in this case. So I wanted to know your opinion. Thank you.
Very good. Es pot preguntar en català o castellà també, perquè com que hi ha traducció i ells tenen traducció no hi ha cap problema. Si hi ha més preguntes, gràcies. Encara aquí, allà al darrere, al mateix cantó, sí. Darrere la columna. Gràcies.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this wonderful event. I think it's safe to say that the Republican Party will take over both houses of Congress this coming September, and it's very likely that the Republican Party will take over the White House in 2024. I mean, it's still early, but President Biden's approval rating is down the floor. So what do you think it will change if such a scenario happens and the Republican Party is back? Thank you.
Should we start with this?
Yeah. We can make a round if you want.
Okay. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, perhaps just a couple of points. So, one point that was made by the first question, the first comments, had to do with Russia-China cooperation, which is something that's interested me quite a lot. And I think my views have shifted considerably in the last 24 hours. Before that, I was convinced that China was going to back Russia more or less no matter what. Certainly diplomatically by not objecting to what they were going to do. I began to rethink that based initially on some developments yesterday with the Asian Investment Bank. Perhaps along the lines of something like the Chinese are getting a bit frustrated because they see Putin and the Russian attack galvanizing such an opposition and not being very successful on the ground. I went further than that this morning, several hours ago, because of the nuclear crisis. I can only imagine that at this point, even the Chinese are probably thinking Putin is not the best horse to back. I suspect there's going to be all sorts of increasing opposition as a result of the crisis because of all the danger he's now putting people in. And I think because of that crisis, views are going to change. It's going to serve as a catalyst to change views. Now, I think perhaps over the longer term, Russia and China will work together again. A lot will depend upon what happens in the next days, weeks in Moscow, whether or not Putin actually survives in power. I'm perhaps getting a bit ahead of myself, thinking that he will actually not survive for very much longer, but we'll just have to see. I certainly don't see him visiting Western Europe anytime soon, that's for sure. On the point about sort of NATO's area of interest, I mean, I think one thing that I did not mention, we can talk about strategic concepts and the documents and the communiques and what's in them and what priority and so forth, but at the end of the day, we need to look at bureaucracy. We need to look at commands. NATO has a command in Naples. There's a joint command that looks at the South. You know, if that's not going anywhere, that's going to be looking at the South, no matter what happens in Eastern Europe. So the same people will be in the same positions, doing the same thing, whether or not they get extra funding, extra personnel, and so forth. You know, we'll see, but I suspect that the main effort will be in Eastern Europe as opposed to what's going on further south. And the final question about the Republican Party and next congressional elections, 2024, what does that actually mean? I suspect if Trump gets into power again, and I really narrow it down to him as opposed to the Republican Party, because as I've seen, the Republican Party, with all due respect to any Republicans here, they tend to turn on a dime on any issue, so they'll flip in a heartbeat. I think their perhaps natural constituency is to be pro-NATO, but because of Trump's comments and their loyalty to Trump, they have sort of been a bit ambiguous about that, although now with Russian aggression, they seem to be changing again. They're not quite sure where the hell they are on Russia and on NATO, but I think probably generally supportive at the moment. But I think what's important to remember is even when Trump was in power, Republicans in Congress were against Trump taking the U.S. out of NATO. They passed this, I can't remember the name of the legislation, but basically insisting that they have some sort of say in whether the U.S. actually gets out of NATO. What always struck me, and I'll be very quick, is the thing about Trump getting out of NATO is I don't think he ever understood how to get out of NATO, because there are various ways of doing it. Was this a military withdrawal or getting out of the military command as France did in 1967, but staying in the alliance? Do you invoke Article 13 and get out altogether? Do you keep military bases in Europe, but get out of NATO and the military command? So those sorts of issues, I don't think he ever really got around to thinking about. I don't think it got that far down the line for them to really seriously consider it, but at least at a rhetorical level, it was very damaging stuff. I mean, it scared a lot of people who were involved in the bureaucracy and allies and so forth that this might actually happen. But again, I don't think it was taken very far.
Mr. Van den Candelare.
Yes. In fact, you can call me Tom as well. If my family name is posing a problem for the success of this meeting. Interesting questions. First, and I'll be brief as well on China. I think China is looking quite carefully at what is happening now and how this is unfolding, especially the way in which we as Europeans react here. And I think the strong sense of unity is something that China and Russia for sure might not have expected. And we, I think, should also quite closely watch how the events indeed are being perceived by Beijing, and how this might change their position in terms of looking at Russia and others. I think I very much agree with what Dr. Michaels has said on that point. On the question on MENA, I do believe that NATO has to keep an eye out also on what is happening in that area. For sure, NATO has a 360 degrees approach, so they will be forced in a way to keep looking at it. But one of the points I would like to pick up on, for example, is the presence of Wagner, private Russian militia in North African countries, Sahel as well. But it is something to keep an eye on, and we need to focus on the MENA region in that respect. We cannot just shift away our attention to only Russia, for example. On the Republicans, quite an interesting question, and I actually agree with the speaker that the chances are quite likely that the scenario he sketched out is going to take place. One thing that I keep in mind from the Trump period is that Trump for us was a big eye-opener in terms of our ability and our over-heavy reliance on NATO and on the Americans. In fact, Trump unwillingly started off this whole process of a stronger European defense, in a way. So I would expect, if we have a next administration of a Republican president, that this might in fact trigger a further response of the Europeans if we were to go again into a Trump scenario, which I obviously don't hope that will happen. So I keep positive, in a way, a positive European souvenir from this whole Trump era. It made that we as Europeans were much more aware and are much more aware of what we need to do on our own in terms of security.
Thank you. Professor Milewski.
Okay. So in terms of Russia-China, again, to comment on that, there's some interesting bits here which weren't mentioned, such as, for example, China was quite hesitant when it came to responding to Russia's recognition of the two Donbass republics, because that sets a precedent. China tends to be very concerned about sovereignty. Russia says it is, but it really isn't. China does seem to be, because it's on that basis that they would then eventually reunify with Taiwan. If all of a sudden they start supporting breakaway republics, that damages their own case regarding Taiwan. So in that sense, they're sort of slightly at arm's length with regard to Russia on that point. On the other hand, from the Russian perspective, given their military deployments or redeployments, where they moved something like 60% of their combat power out of the east, and might be rising now, since there's suggestions that they're moving even more from the east and the south toward Ukraine. That suggests a real comfort with China, that China won't take advantage of that sort of military weakness or anything, which again, that comfort might be pretty meaningful in certain situations. Regarding North Africa and the south, yes, it'll still be there, sort of. You can't ignore an entire continent. But I think it is important to recognize that the quality of the threat differs. Whereas, of course, what's going on in the Sahel, in North Africa, whatever, that is a security threat. What's going on, or what might hypothetically go on in the east, for certain countries would be an existential threat. It's, a bit of a distinction in that case. Regarding the Republicans, yes, I mean, hopefully they don't find success, but we'll see. What's interesting though is that generally speaking, it seems to be that the GOP sort of representatives in Congress tend to be more hawkish and more activist internationally than their base. So perhaps we can expect that pattern to continue regardless of anything else.
Sorry, as one final comment on Russia-China, as I talked about Chinese perceptions of Russia. I think perhaps Russian perceptions of the Chinese have also changed in the last few days. The reason I say that is because you probably saw on the news, there's a rather large column of Russian vehicles that's sort of heading towards Kiev. Well, the reason why they're stuck is because the tires are actually very cheap Chinese-made tires, which is to say, I don't think that the Russian military is ever going to buy Chinese ever again. Thank you.
Well, I think that's the final comment.
Yes.
And then we will be more or less on time. So time for a coffee break, and we see you again for the second panel. Thank you very much. And thank you very much indeed to our panelists for your thoughts. Thank you.
Nice bit about the tires.
I had to bring that in.